Donald Trump today resorting to a familiar tactic, spreading lies and smears on one of his favorite cable news programs in the wake of the House Democrats' public hearings this week, providing irrefutable evidence that Donald Trump conditioned military aid in a White House meeting for a U.S. ally at war on that country's commitment to conduct investigations that would benefit Trump politically. The New York Times writes, quote, President Trump unleashed a series of falsehoods on Friday in an effort to invalidate the impeachment inquiry and counter sworn testimony from officials in his own administration after a week of damaging public hearings. And while divisions in our politics endure, it's beyond debate that the Democrats' fact witnesses, the majority of them Trump appointees and career diplomats, painted a devastating picture of presidential misconduct that was damning enough that the New York Times today describes Trump's Republican allies as, quote, all but certain that the House will move forward to impeach President Trump. NBC News reports today that the House is expecting to vote on articles of impeachment in a matter of weeks as Republicans face a devastating dismantling of their last remaining defenses against the allegations at the heart of the Ukraine scandal. The Washington Post adds this, quote, the committee has begun writing a report summarizing its findings, according to people familiar with the matter who spoke anonymously to discuss the Democrats' next move. Once that's completed, proceedings move to the House Judiciary Committee, which will draft specific articles of impeachment. The Judiciary Committee could begin its work when lawmakers return from Thanksgiving. What we now know for certain, based on the public testimony of 12 of Trump's own current and former administration officials, is that there was, without question, a quid pro quo with Ukraine. A pursuit Trump's former senior aide Fiona Hill rebranded this week as, quote, political errands. We've also learned that the Ukrainians knew full well that their military aid was in jeopardy as early as the day of the July 25th phone call, when Trump asked Zelensky for a favor, though. Investigations into the Bidens, and that when it came to the day-to-day machinations of the pressure campaign, everyone was in the loop, and the president himself was calling the shots. Here's that story again in the words of Trump's own top officials.
Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Was there a quid pro quo? The answer is yes.
What did Ambassador Sondland tell you that he told Mr. Yermak?
That the Ukrainians would have to have the prosecutor general make a statement with respect to the investigations as a condition of having the aid lifted.
Your staff at least gleaned from those conversations that the Ukrainian embassy was aware that there was some kind of a hold on the assistance.
So the way I would phrase it is that there was some kind of an issue. Yes.
Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and I worked with Mr. Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine matters at the express direction of the President of the United States.
I was upset with him that he wasn't fully telling us about all of the meetings that he was having. And he said to me, but I'm briefing the President. I'm briefing Chief of Staff Mulvaney. I'm briefing Secretary Pompeo, and I've talked to Ambassador Bolton. Who else do I have to deal with? He was being involved in a domestic political errand. And we were being involved in national security foreign policy, and those two things had just diverged. I did say to him, Ambassador Sondland, Gordon, I think this is all going to blow up, and here we are.
And here we are. Those witnesses, again, some of whom still work in the Trump administration, are consistent, and they tell a damaging story, leaving such little room for spin that President Trump today had to resort to an attack on Ukraine and a baseless conspiracy theory that every single one of the witnesses to date has debunked in a head-spinning rebuttal interview this morning on Fox and Friends.
Why should we give money to a country that's known corrupt? It's a very corrupt country. I mean, I love the people in Ukraine. I know Ukrainian people. They're great people. But it's known as being the third most corrupt country in the world. Now, with this guy, who, by the way, I hardly know him, okay, I still want to see that server. You know, the FBI has never gotten that server. That's a big part of this whole thing. Why did they give it to a Ukrainian company?
Are you sure they did that? Are you sure they gave it to Ukraine?
Well, that's what the word is, and that's what I asked actually in my phone call, if you know. Right. I mean, I asked it very point blank because we're looking for corruption.
That's what the word is from whom? From Rudy? Again, there's no truth to what the president is saying. And as a new report in the New York Times reveals, his claims that Ukraine meddled in the 2016 election is literally a Russian talking point, part of a years-long Russian operation to blame Ukraine to deflect from what it got caught doing, interfering in our election in 2016. That's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance joins us. Michael Steele, former chairman of the RNC, is here at the table. Kimberly Atkins, senior correspondent for Boston's public news station, WBUR. New York Times political reporter Nick Confessori, and former communications director for the Jeb Bush 2016 campaign, contributor for The Bulwark, Tim Miller's here. Kim, I have to start with you. I mean, you could not make up a news cycle to prove that everything that Fiona Hill tried to tell Donald Trump behind closed doors fell on deaf ears, than to put Donald Trump on Fox and Friends, where he repeats the conspiracy theories that she and Tom Bossert and John Bolton tried to beat out of him for 3 years.
You're absolutely right. And not just the very convincing testimony by Fiona Hill, but a culmination of 2 weeks of stories which all fit together to paint this picture of this, what she called this domestic political errand that was completely divergent from U.S. policy, and that was focused specifically on getting information about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden in exchange for either a White House meeting, which the Ukrainians wanted, a phone call, or most importantly, aid at a time when the country was at war with Russia. Every official painted the same picture. Even those like Gordon Sondland, somebody who got his job after giving $1 million to Trump's inaugural committee. It was a very damning 2 weeks of testimony, and it seems that the president has settled on A, digging in, and B, continuing to put forward these talking points that we've heard from him, and we've heard them from Rudy Giuliani about Ukraine, which have been disproven.
You know, Nick, you're in the business of investigative journalism, and you go about, and if it's a dicey story, I know you need at least 2 sources, right? And if it's really dicey, you need 3 or 4. It would seem that to prove a quid pro quo, the Democrats had 17 witnesses. I mean, it's proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump conditioned military aid for a U.S. ally, a democracy, at risk from Russia on politically motivated investigations into 2016 and into the Bidens, and he told us so. So on a factual basis, I mean, where would you rank sort of the veracity of the case the Democrats made?
If I was a reporter, and I am, I'd be super confident in taking out of the phrase alleged and just saying this is what actually happened. Wow. We now know what really happened. We know what the trade was. I would say if this was like a jigsaw puzzle, instead of the one where like you try and figure out where the pieces fit together, we sort of started with like the border already built, and we were kind of filling in the middle. Now we have the whole thing. It's actually very clear. Yeah. We have learned some important new things, obviously, from these hearings, but they're mostly about precise issues of timing, which are always helpful in figuring out something, kind of who knew what when, the president's involvement, Mulvaney's involvement, and the Ukrainians' knowledge of what was happening at any given time. Those are all important ingredients. It wasn't like it was a pointless exercise, but man, everything is pretty nailed down now.
You know, it's a great point, Joyce, and I was thinking about it with Nick sitting here from an investigative journalist perspective, but you're a prosecutor. I mean, Andrew Weissman was at our table yesterday, and other prosecutors. I mean, if you ask people if they'd take this case and if they think they could prove it, Claire McCaskill said, I could take it, I could prove it, pretty cut and dry.
You know, in a criminal case, which impeachment is not, the burden of proof is the highest burden in our legal system, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But what judges tell juries is that that doesn't mean that you have to exclude any possible doubt. You don't have to include every scintilla of doubt. You just have to be comfortable enough with the evidence that you would use it to act on one of the most important decisions in your own personal life. And that, I think, is what we see here. When I hear Nick say that he would take out the word alleged, That means a lot to me, and I view this evidence the same way. The only defense that this president has ever tried to mount here is the defense that he's a corruption fighter, Trump who is anti-corruption. And aside from the fact that that defense is completely laughable for all of the reasons that we know and talk about every day, what really nails it is the fact that if Trump wanted to fight corruption in Ukraine, he would have kept Marie Yovanovitch on the job. She was a known corruption fighter. There's no reason to bring in a bumbling Rudy Giuliani and the three amigos. So every defense that the president has to offer here, I think as a criminal case, this would be very strong.
Michael Steele and Tim Miller from the party formerly known as Republicans. Let me read you what Peggy Noonan, who once hailed from said party as well. She writes in the Wall Street Journal, Trump's defenders have no defense. What was said consistently undermined Mr. Trump's case, but more deadly was what has never been said. In the 2 months since Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced a formal impeachment inquiry was underway, in the 2 weeks since the Intelligence Committee's public hearings began, no one, even in the White House, has said anything like, he wouldn't do that, or that would be so unlike him. His best friends know he would do it, and it's exactly like him. The case has been so clearly made, you wonder what exactly the Senate will be left doing. How will they hold a lengthy trial with a case that is this clear? Who exactly will be the president's witnesses? Those who testify they didn't do what he appears to have done and would never do it. Michael Steele?
Well, I'll answer that. Well, bravo, first off, on that piece. But I would answer the question of the trial itself as it will be nothing more than a show trial. It will go down one of two paths. Either those impeachment articles will come to the Senate and be put in the drawer of the Senate president because he feels, Mr. McConnell, that there's nothing that merits a trial. Or if he feels that, OK, we'll just go through the process, they'll go through the process. But we already know the vote, don't we? Because
the
jurors have told us, at least one of them has said, I'm not even going to read what comes out of this, Mr. Lindsey Graham. I'm not even going to bother reading it. So if you imagine as a citizen going into a courtroom, right? And you're one of the jurors, you're going to do your civic duty, and the guy next to you goes, I'm not even going to read this stuff. I'm not even going to bother with it. I mean, the whole system becomes corrupted. And that's the end game here. That's what it's been from Jim Jordan to Lindsey Graham. This is all about corrupting this process so vilely that the American people are turned off and turned away.
It is such a sad commentary, and I'm only picking on my friend Michael Steele because I find it guts me that this is what the Republican Party's turned into, that the corruption is in the GOP in Washington. The corruption isn't in Ukraine. I mean, I'm jealous that people like Marie Yovanovitch sort of walked the line and rooted out corruption there. Maybe they can bring her to Washington and put her to work in the Congress, Tim.
Well, look, exactly what the president and Rudy Giuliani are accusing Joe Biden of doing is what they did in Ukraine. Right. It was Rudy Giuliani who went to Ukraine, who had business interests, who wanted there to be changes in the way that they did natural gas business in Ukraine because he had clients there. It was this administration that has done that and now in Ukraine and Turkey and Saudi Arabia where they have businesses and where they're corrupt. And you're right, the entire Senate has been corrupted by this. Look, Lindsey Graham, there was a video going around of him doing an interview with my friend Scott Conroy about 4 years ago where he gets emotional talking about Joe Biden. He says there's no better man than Joe Biden. And here he is today putting forth just a basically for show investigation for the Senate that he knows is BS against Joe Biden. Because whatever you think about what Hunter did, and it was, probably a little bit dirty, Joe Biden went into Ukraine to encourage.
What was dirty about it? I mean, I just want to be careful with our words.
Yeah, sure,
I mean, no one we had 11 witnesses testify publicly. Sure. No one testified anything dirty. What are you? I just want to let you be really specific. Are you saying it looked bad, or what are you saying?
The optics are terrible, and obviously Hunter Biden, doesn't have the expertise in this area. I think that's a fair point that the Republicans are making on the Hill. But here's the problem: is that they are obscuring the reality of the point, which is that Joe Biden, President Obama, and multiple other members of the Obama administration went into Ukraine with an earnest effort to stop corruption. They wanted to get rid of the prosecutor because he wasn't prosecuting the company that Hunter Biden worked for. That was a genuine anti-corruption effort. So what Joe Biden did was perfectly fine.
I mean, here's what else they're obscuring. If a real crime happened, Donald Trump sits atop the part of the government where he can pick up the phone and call the Justice Department with a tip. I mean, they've got tip lines.
Or better than
that. If a real crime happened, you don't call a fake corruption hunter like Rudy Giuliani.
And by the way, that goes doubly true for Ron Johnson and Lindsey Graham and all those people who were in the Senate when this happened. Like, this wasn't an ancient history. The Republicans controlled the House and the Senate when Joe Biden was going over to Ukraine to do anti-corruption efforts. If they thought that the deal was rotten, they could have done investigations then. They didn't. Ron Johnson signed a letter saying he agreed that the prosecutor should be fired. It's all a farce.
Well, you know, it doesn't have to be. I mean, listen, maybe I have watched too many Aaron Sorkin movies, but I mean, there is still a scenario where I thought some tectonic plates shifted this week. I thought one of them was Gordon Sondland's sort of early morning release of his statement where he says everybody was in on it. I wasn't rogue. I wasn't part of an irregular policy channel. This was the channel. It was run by Donald Trump, Vice President Pence, and Mike Pompeo. This was the channel. And then I thought a plate shifted again when Fiona Hill came in yesterday and said, you are doing Russia's work for them. Do we really think there's no scenario where if John Bolton were to sort of find religion and walk in and testify in a Senate trial, that Republicans who've trusted John Bolton for decades wouldn't say,
Yeah, look, I think the one variable here is public opinion. We have seen that shifted since, for example, the Mueller investigation, which seemed to go on and on, at times seemed very convoluted and hard to wrap your head around. The last 2 weeks has painted a fairly clear picture. We're going into a break. We're going to have people sitting, you know, and they're not supposed to talk about politics at the Thanksgiving table, but I have a feeling that will be happening. And people have been, look, when I travel across, I've been everywhere from California to the East Coast and in the Midwest, everyone stops and asks about the impeachment. It's on people's minds.
On people's minds.
People are going to be talking about it. People are going to be digesting what has happened over the last 2 weeks, and they're going to be the lawmakers are going to be hearing from them about it. If that shifts, particularly some more moderate Republicans, we may hear folks begin to speak out more. That may tip the needle, but I think otherwise.
Well, they might not be Republicans. I can see Michael Steele shaking his head. Let me just come back to Joyce, though, on a piece of the fact pattern. I'll give you the last word, Michael Steele. Joyce, I think that a large swath of the American public that may not be the ones that watch primetime on any cable news channel, but a part of the public has now watched, and they may not have been compelled by or moved by or alarmed by the Mueller hearing, but they learned that Robert Mueller couldn't touch Donald Trump because a sitting president can't be indicted. They may not have watched Michael Cohen testify, but they knew that some other guy associated with Trump is sitting in jail with a guy, I don't know, what's his name, the situation. But Donald Trump, even though he's an unindicted co-conspirator there, he can't go to jail because he's president. So Donald Trump can't get in trouble in any federal criminal investigation. And now Donald Trump can't get in trouble for a crime he confesses to on the South Lawn of the White House that 17 people who work for him, half of them he picked himself, attest to. I mean, I think there is a sense among the public that maybe Donald Trump should be accountable to somebody, no?
I think that you've identified the problem, and it goes back to what Kim said about how important public opinion is here. In some ways, maybe more important, than the evidence itself, because the problem is half of the country is appalled by the notion that a president would succeed in holding himself above the law. But there's another half of the country that says, we like this guy. This is what we signed up for. He's somebody who's always had animosity for the system, and they don't seem troubled by it. And so what we see happening, I think, especially in the wake of Dr. Hill's testimony and the reporting today that the Senate has been briefed by the intelligence community on the fact that Moscow has been running since at least 2017 an effort to push this Ukrainian narrative that it was Ukraine, not Moscow, that was responsible for interference in the 2016 election. The shift that will have to come is that the American public will have have to look at that piece of the puzzle and sort of back up from all of the evidence, all of the trees, and look at the whole forest and say, you know, the Soviet Union may have lost the Cold War, but Putin has extracted a hell of a payback on us over the last couple of years, trying to tear us apart, trying to manipulate us. And it's only at the point where public opinion shifts and says, we won't stand for this, and conveys that to their legislators, to their Republican senators, that there's really any chance that there's real movement. I think in some ways that overall vision is more important than the individual pieces of evidence, because they're damning, but they haven't created any movement.
Michael Steele.
Yeah, I think that last point is the crux of this. I just don't see that movement happening. I think the president and his team, very much as we saw with the Mueller case, have been somewhat successful with creating a narrative in which this is not as important as the Democrats. Notice during this entire thing, the Democrats talked about my colleagues, the gentleman across the aisle. Republicans emphasize the Democrats are doing this. The Democrats are doing this. They have politicized this thing down to the point where it is almost meaningless to some voters. And the polling right now is showing people backing off of this idea of moving forward with impeachment. So there has been some success by what we've seen in the House and the performances that took place over the last couple of weeks. The president spending 53 minutes on Fox News this morning. Dude, do you have a job? Do you work? How do you have 53 minutes on television, right? But that's the point. That's the point. The most important job is to dumb down the conversation and to drive home the narrative that just as there was no collusion, there's still no quid pro quo.
Do you think anybody believes that?
Yes, a lot more than we probably want to admit. And you're going to hear a lot of that this Thanksgiving dinner around Turkey.
I think they believe it because Donald Trump said it. I think they don't care. I mean, I don't disagree with you on the politics, but I actually think this is different. I think they bought that there was no collusion because as friends of Donald Trump will tell you privately, right. They don't think he's smart enough to collude with Vladimir Putin. But I think everybody thinks that he's dirty enough to have held over the head of a fragile democracy military aid in exchange for dirt and his bat bleep crazy conspiracy theory.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.